Okay, good morning, everyone. Well, it's morning where I am. Good day, good evening, dependent on where you are. We seem to be short our chair, and I have not received any information about why they are not here yet, but I'll just go ahead and start our session. I'm Roman Keeney from Purdue University. The person we're expecting is Antonia. I was not expecting to do this. So, and God, God's me, I believe. Our first presenter, could you say your name? I'm sorry.
Qiao Min.
Chow Mein. Okay, that's what
Yes.
I had. That's what I had prepared. But since you're here, from University of Science and Technology, Beijing, our session is on trade agreements, which we're all interested in. Hopefully, we'll have some people filter in. Third day of the conference is always a little rough on people. But with that, I'll hand the floor over if you want to go ahead, Chamin, and share your presentation, and we'll begin. I have the recording started, and I will be the one keeping time, uh, and I'll give you a cue at about 2 minutes to go. Thanks.
Yes. Okay. So can you see my slides now? Yes. Okay. Good. Hello everyone. I am Qiaomin Li from University of Science and Technology Beijing, and my paper is about behind the border measures in free trade agreements. And I try to study whether the behind the border measures can benefit domestic firms rather than to see trade or FDI effects as usually we do. So in this paper, I start this paper because I read a report or study about the potential EU-China FTA. In this study, the authors list several investment barriers in China that EU firms mentioned or raised for the EU government to argue or to negotiate with China. And such issues include the inward FDI in China is heavily regulated by many laws, regulations, etc. And in the implementation of these regulations, there are exceptions often happens. And the author says that while the large firms may be able to cope with such an environment, but SMEs may be hurt by the opaque and discretionary investment regime. So when I read this, I found that this is not only a barrier for foreign firms, this may be also a barrier for domestic firms. So I come up with the idea that if the FTA can deal with such regulatory barriers, which can be classified as behind the border measures in free trade agreements, then domestic firms may be benefit as well as the foreign firms. So this is the motivation I did this start this study. As for the behind the border measures, sorry, I had to escape the full screen. I will use this kind of view. As for the behind the border measures, it is a hot topic in trade policy, but not much studies in literature. I only found a definition from Kawasaki 2015. He defines behind the border measures as non-tariff measures that flow from domestic laws, regulations, and practices, which are different from border barriers of non-NTMs. And in FTAs, BBM, which are behind the border measures, cover issues such as transparency, IPR, competition, services, and investment. So in essence, BBM tries to deal with regulatory coherence. That is to help firms conducting international study to avoid the adoption costs. That's the definition I found from literature and from practice. Then in this study, I try to define BBM as 3 layers. First is the BBM in free trade agreements first tackles or aims to tackle the regulation barriers directly related to foreign trade and investment. So in this case, the foreign suppliers will be facilitated by BBM. Then in the second layer, the regulations that are applied to both foreign and domestic firms, such as the regulation regime, might be dealt with in free trade agreements. In this case, both foreign and domestic suppliers might be benefit. And then in the third layer, as the article written by Wang 2016 say that BBM may trigger domestic laws and economic reform. So in this case, mainly the domestic suppliers would be impacted by BBMs. So I modeled the BBM into a CGE model. In this model, the firm structure is like this. In a region, the firms are classified or split to domestic firms and foreign invested firms. So domestic firms here is the focus of this paper. We try to see whether BBM can have a positive effect on them. For each type of firms, there are exporters and non-exporters. So the mechanism of BBM impact on firms is through fixed trading costs, because this CGE model is based on firm heterogeneity theory of Melis and Helpman. So based on literatures and practice study, I assume that BBM will reduce the fixed trading costs of firms. So how does it work? I don't know why it doesn't go. So I use this. So this is the structure, how BBMs impact on firms. For example, there are 2 regions, A and B, which have an FTA. And then the BBM will impact on the exports from A to B first. By that, the region B may commit some regulatory adjustments for the foreign firms, like to make adjustments to its regulation related to foreign trade or foreign investment. Maybe it also try to adjust its regulatory regime to make it more efficient, more transparent. In that case, the non-exporters of domestic firms may also be impacted by BBM. So in this case, I assume that for exporters, their fixed costs will be reduced by like 20%. For the non-exporters in region B, which is a smaller reduction, 10%, because I assume that the FTA, the BBM in FTA, firstly targets on the export barriers. So in that case, the BBM will impact on the region B's, the exporters and non-exporters. When the B export back to A, its exporters will also face a reduction of 20% fixed cost. And region A's non-exporters also have a reduction of 10% fixed cost. So this is the mechanism of how BBM impact on the domestic firms. Besides that, I also experiment with FDI liberalization by assuming that the FDI liberalization is mainly through BBM. So FDI from members will be reduced 20% of fixed costs, non-members 10%. And this is the whole structure of all the FTA tools, how they are modeled in the CGE model. And the FTA tools include tariff and non-tariff measures. Within non-tariff, the BBM are split out, and then the other cross-border measures. And they affect variable costs and fixed cost range on different types of firms. And then the CGE model applied to the RCEP, because RCEP has achieved achieved the highest level of commitments in several BBMs, such as services, IPR, and e-commerce. And the data applied is based on GTAP 9 with a base year of 2011. This may look a little bit old because we have 10 with us now. That is because this paper is relatively goes a long history of publication, which have not been succeeded yet. So that's why I use an older version of GTAP data, which is complemented by FDI data and foreign affiliate sales data and NTB data or NTM data. And for the simulation scenarios, first, for the baseline scenario, I conduct a 4FTA scenario. What is the 4FTA means? Let me try to broadcast again. The 4FTA, here this graph shows the 4FTA. That is, these FTAs are bound after 2011, the base year of the GTAP data base 9. But before RCEP. So by conducting such a simulation, we exclude the effects of the 4 FTAs. In these 4 FTAs, A and Z, which represent Australia and New Zealand, which are aggregated to one region, is at the hub. It has FTAs with Japan, China, and Korea. So with this baseline, the 4 FTAs are assumed to reduce tariffs by 90%, NTMs by 20%. After that, we conduct 5 RCEP simulations. The first one is no BBM, that is without behind-the-border measures in RCEP. In this scenario, we assume the remaining 6 bilateral trade relations of the RCEP reduce tariff to the same level as a 4 FTA. The remaining 6 bilateral trade relations refers to these 6. So in this, the remaining relations, ASEAN is at the hub, and Japan is kind of a sub-hub position in the remaining bilateral trade relationship. Trade liberalization. So in this scenario, we kind of raise the whole RCEP region to the same level of liberalization as the 4 FTAs. Then we contrast we form a contrast scenario, BBM, that is we simulate with behind-the-border measures. In this scenario, the RCEP will reduce fixed costs of domestic firms by 20% for exporters and 10% for non-exporters. Then there is a scenario with BBM and FDI liberalization. So the same assumption is 20% for FDI firms from partners and 10% from other regions. And lastly, we conduct 2 scenarios by assuming India joins the RCEP. NBBMI refers to RCEP without BBM, and BBM refers Indian Jones RCEP with BBM. So here's the results. First, the exports. In this graph, we can see that Japan will expand exports dramatically, since the RCEP is the first time Japan liberalized with China and Korea. Both are big markets in East Asia. And the BBMs compared with non-BBM scenario can help CJK, that is China, Japan, and Korea, export more than in the no BBM. And this table shows the productivity threshold changes of domestic firms in each region. So in the first column, that is the production country, and then sell to these markets. And the two scenarios. And there are two sectors, two heterogeneous sectors, manufacturing and traded services. There are two other homogeneous sectors, agriculture and non-traded services, but they have no productivity thresholds. So the red numbers in this table shows where the productivity threshold raise or increase. We can see from the table that the RCEP tends to raise productivity thresholds of non-exporters, that is, the firms supply local markets, as well as the exporters to the previously liberalized markets, such as ANZ to Japan, which will be raised by the RCEP or by the trade liberalization. The possible explanation is because of the competition from increased imports in the Japan market from China, from Korea firms. So this is the first result. And then we can compare the two scenarios. We can find that the BBMs can help reduce productivity thresholds for both non-exporters and exporters. So BBM can reduce the productivity threshold for these domestic firms. That means more firms or less productive firms can enter the market now. So we can expect an increase of domestic firm numbers in BBM scenario. And this figure shows the result. And we can also note that the blue bars shows the decrease of domestic firm numbers from NBBM scenario. This is due to the competition effect of imports or trade liberalization. And we also see the sales changes of domestic firms. And in this table, we still compare NBBM with BBM. First, we see the sales to foreign markets. These are the RCEP member regions or member countries. We can see that they all will expand exports in both non-BBM and BBM. But for China, Japan, and Korea, their export expansion becomes much larger in this scenario. That is, BBMs can benefit CJK, especially in foreign sales. And then we see the sales to local markets. In the no BBM scenario, we could see that Japan will contract sales to local markets a lot, and the total number is will decrease 5.4%. But in the BBM scenario, we could see that the Japan's decrease become smaller. That is, even in this scenario, Japan's domestic firms still face competition from imports. but their contraction in local sales becomes smaller. While for China, Korea, ASEAN, the competition effect is not that significant for their domestic sales. And BBM can even enlarge their increase to the local sales. So we draw a conclusion that BBMs can benefit CGK and ASEAN domestic firms in local sales. And lastly is the total sales, which follow the same pattern. And then in the BBM FDI scenario, we found that FDI liberalization through BBMs can increase foreign firm numbers, or the FDI numbers, and then domestic firm numbers still expand with both expansions in FDI numbers and imports. And the sales patterns of domestic firms does not change much by FDI liberalization. And this table shows the result of India. In the first scenario, without BBM, India will expand exports by 2.7%, but the local sales will contract by 0.68%. Total sales still increase in this scenario. And the firm numbers will increase by 1.7%. So even if India join the RCEP without BBM, it won't be hurt that much since its total sales will increase. Only the agriculture may contract by 4.1%. And
2 minutes, please.
Okay. If India joins the RCEP with BBMs, all its sales to the exports, domestic sales, and total sales will become positive. That is, it won't be hurt from the total sales. That is, RCEP with BBMs can benefit India firms by expanding both exports and local sales. And this graph shows the welfare gains of India. In the first two, there's no India, and the last two bars shows with India joins the RCEP, so we can see clearly the pattern. And then lastly, the welfare of RCEP members. We could see that RCEP can benefit most members, especially the RCEP with BBMs can benefit CGK and ASEAN much more to the welfare gain. So in conclusion, the BBMs can benefit benefit domestic firms by promoting firm numbers, by increasing foreign sales, local sales, or by mitigating the negative shocks of import competition. That is in the case of Japan. So then I will stop here. Thank you. Shall I stop share my screen?
Thank you. Now that would be good. Thank you, Chomin. So sorry, I still don't see our chair, so I'll open the floor for questions. You can type them in the chat, and I will read them to the group. You can raise your hand, and I will call on you, or you could unmute yourself and pose your question directly. I think that would work as well with a smaller group as we have. But I'll just ask one clarifying question while we see if anything comes through the chat. I was not paying enough attention. You said you based this on GTAP, the 9th database, version 9 database?
Yes.
And I heard you give some reason, but I missed what you said. If you wouldn't mind just giving me some of that, and particularly just discussing that. Yeah.
Yes, this is a kind of old paper, not that new, because it goes a long period for publication, but still not succeed yet. So I try to present it in this conference to see what's the problem with it that may hinder its publication. So that's why I use all the word of GTAP database.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I wasn't clear. I thought you said something like that, but I think we've all been there. So it's a common problem. Sarah has added a question to the chat box. You can read it there, but I'll read it out loud for the group. Which closure and tools did you use for applying shocks to NTMs in the GTAP framework?
Do you use for giving shocks to NTM in GTAP? This model, first I clarify that this model is not based on GTAP. I developed this model in my PhD study, and so this is basically a FDICG model, which tries to deal with the effect of free trade agreement on FDI flow. And it is based on from heterogeneity theory of Melis and Helperman. And so in dealing with NTMs, first the NTMs, I use some estimations, tariff equivalence of NTMs drawn from literature, and then for most for the agriculture and manufacturing sectors, these are treated as the same as tariffs. So they will raise the trade variable costs on the trading firms. And for the services sectors, the NTM are treated as have both cost raising effect and a rent generating effect, which follows a paper by Colnam and Mascus. So in the services, the part of NTM will raise the trade variable cost, and a part of NTM will raise the rent or generate a rent to the incumbent firms in the market. So is that what you mean? Okay.
Thank you for that answer. We still have a couple minutes for discussion. If I don't see any hands up, but if someone wants to pose a final question. Okay, well, with that, best of luck as you continue to push this towards publication. I certainly enjoyed the presentation. Thank you for it. Let's move ahead and start. Sorry, I don't have any. Akeem is our second presenter. Akeem Vogt from World Trade Institute in Bern. You can go ahead and start sharing your screen if you'd like, and I'll pass the floor over to you to begin.
Will do. That should be it, right? Okay. So first, let me apologize that what is on the website is not mostly up to date, and I was a bit under time pressure. And this is now a significantly revised presentation, also in terms of the approach and identification strategy. And the topic is regulatory heterogeneity in PTAs, and it's very much in the same context as the previous study, that with declining tariffs, that actually it is assumed, or it has been shown, that differences in the structure and stringencies of countries' technical regulations induce higher trade costs that are actually a magnitude of tariffs, and that modern PTAs actually now try to address these by adding types of harmonization provisions that try to lower those trade costs. And in this presentation, when I talk about technical product regulations, I mainly talk about SPS and TBT measures. And what I try to do in this paper is to separately identify different types of effects that you can derive. It's behind the border effects, at the border effects of MFN type of measures, as well as actually to introduce a measure of structural regulatory differences. And from these sort of baseline NTM estimates, you can do basically achieve regulatory harmonization via actual PTAs, or you can actually harmonize via what I would call regulatory upscaling, or introducing regulation that mimics the structure of the regulation that your trade partners have, and by this actually reduce the trade costs. So this basically a non-exhaustive overview of related studies, and well, there are those that actually try to estimate the effect of PTAs in different variants with different interactions, with or without NTM interactions, different types of provisions. Something to point out here is probably the Egger et al. 2015 paper, which uses an identification strategy to separate the tariff and the non-tariff component that is similar to what I use here, or basically the same. And also the Cadeau and Godon paper, who use the same data set for NTMs and or actually interact those NTMs with different types of provisions and PTAs. And then you have those studies that actually look at the kind of like baseline NTM effects, using different data, using different underlying assumptions of what is a restrictive NTM, and also finding different effects. So for example, Begin et al., they find some positive effects, some trade promoting effects of some NTMs. Similar Gozi in 2019 for Chinese TBTs, having that some trade promoting effects. And an interesting study is the Grunke and Moser, who look at the actual enforcement of technical measures or SPS measures at the US border, and shows that this is actually non-random, and that in times of crisis, the FDA at the border is actually applying a more stringent approach to SPS measures. And then you have those studies that actually try to flesh out the effect of regulatory differences. And those are also mostly done at the product level. So you have an early one is the Winchester et al., who use it for agricultural products and actually have very specific regulatory data like MRL limits and all these things, where they can actually have a very substantive difference measure, and similar to Jiang and Begin. The data that I use is more closely to the Untitled study, which is basically a distance measure based on binary data. So this is a classical gravity paper where I have YOD is just the trade flow, Z is a controls with the standard distance controls, but also controls for home market heterogeneity. So I work in a cross section, and I include internal flows, and to allow for a heterogeneous border effect, I include interactions of the border dummy with proxies for internal trade costs. We have the PTA inclusive tariff rate, and PTA and NTM indicator, and destination origin fixed effects. What types of NTMs do I include? There are those that are actually identified at behind the border, right? Like in the previous presentation, you would have those measures that most likely not only fall on the foreign firm, but also on the domestic market. Those are labeling, packaging and labeling requirements, certain tolerance limits or substance use limits. You would have different hygienic requirements on all these things that actually domestic producers probably also have to comply to. Then you would have those measures that are actually identified at the border that only fall on the importer or on foreign firms. Those are kind of like import authorization schemes or quarantine requirements, but also pre-shipment inspections. And then you have this set of non-technical measures like quantity measures or price control measures, which also just fall on the exporter. So these are included. And in terms of PTA indicators, there is a general PTA dummy, and count indices of PTA harmonization provisions or SPS and TBT measures that are related to standards, risk conformity assessments, audits, controls, and regulations. So those that actually relate to the NTM and have some harmonization, deep integration type of properties. And the second indicator is those SPS and TBT provisions that are weaker in a sense, and are just relate to transparency, cooperation, institution building. So those that I would call facilitate integration. How are the concepts operationalized? So, well, there's for regulatory differences, there's I use to mimic or to proxy regulatory stringency, the average number of measures. Right, so for a given MFN type of policy, you look at whether the destination country imposes a measure on a product I, and this product is some part of an aggregate K and part of a group of measures, SPS, TBT, or technical measures. And then you look, okay, and D is just a dummy whether the product is actually an aggregate K, and then you would have the average number per measure per product within that sector. And as a distance measure, I use something called the Jakarta Distance, where A is simply the number of measures that the origin and destination have in common for a product I, and B and C are the measures, the number of measures that only the origin imposes or only the destination imposes. So you would have an indicator that, or distance indicator that only decreases when two countries have a measure in common. So that I think facilitates the interpretation of the coefficients, because if you take a measure which also decreases in joint absences, you would always be puzzled whether, okay, is the indicator, is the coefficient now based on a decrease on measures that are not there or measures that are there. Then in terms of PTA depths, I just use a simple count index. And when you see the regression tables, those are all evaluated at the average value of the NTM variable of the PTA partners. So all the coefficients are evaluated at that average, and consequently also the standard errors can already be readily interpreted. So the identification strategy is first kind of like a three-step approach in that sense. At first, we actually try to flesh out the tariff component of the PTA, and this is done by the tariff inclusive PTA by the PTA inclusive tariff rate. So any type of PTA dummies or the technical indexes, they can all be they don't include any tariff components anymore. Then for NTMs that are employed at the border, those are quarantine requirements, etc. And the non-technical measures, we use the interaction with the border dummy that's based on height et al. Then the problem with the height et al. Approach is, and why we can't use that for NTMs that for behind the border measures, is that most likely these things also affect exports as well as domestic production. So you cannot really separately identify that. That has been, for example, shown by Vivarelli et al. So the idea here is then to use the approach of Honoré and Kishina, and who basically show that for panel data, but it can be transferred to this cross-sectional setup as well, where who show that once you actually estimate the main equation, you can use the predictions of the bilateral components to basically kind of residualize the main variable, and then actually you can identify the destination or origin specific variables. So for the it's two heterogeneity corrections by just a simple residual inclusion approach from the first stage, OLS on the regulatory distance, where I include all the variables of the second stage, and also two instruments, the common legal history and the colonial history after 45. So those turn out to be good predictors for the distance. And then for trade agreement, I assume that there are different selection processes depending on the depth. So I follow the Eggert-Al approach and use a control function for mutually exclusive levels of PTA depth, and where its PTA cut is basically just a dummy when PTA falls within a certain depth. So in terms of data, I use a 2014 cross-section of GTAP trade flows. I exclude the energy sectors and services sectors from the aggregates. And the 98 countries are basically the intersection of the NTM data and the trade data. I use the UNCTAD NTM trades data. For tariffs, I use a blended tariff rate where I basically cascade down an order of preference where first use the ITC APA rates. If those are not available, the ITC preferential rates, then trains preferential rates, etc., and cascade down to the WTA bound rate. And I do that at the 6-digit level before aggregating up again. So in order to capture the kind of the home market interactions and to capture the concept of internal trade costs, I use a pool of variables that mimic geographic size, that look at the quality of physical, technological, and financial infrastructure, logistics performance, the quality of governance, and the political landscape, and basically run a PCA on that and use the first four components on that, which capture about 90% of the variation in this data, and interact that with a border to kind of get to mimic the internal trade costs. In terms of just a picture, what kind of patterns do we see with NTMs? So this on the left, you would see the Jakarta distance mapped onto a two-dimensional plane, and what you see is, I felt reminded from the presentation of Emily Blanchard in the first plenary session that you would have kind of like different factories in the world, and that kind of pattern is here as well, where you would say a factory Latin America, you would have here a regional cluster, would have here a European cluster, you would have an Asia Pacific cluster here. You would and so there are really region matters. So you would have the Middle East, North Africa cluster. So it tends to be that there's a regional component in the way countries regulate. So on the right, you would see where we map the average number per measures against the average number of unique measures per product. So it's a way on to say, okay, well, do countries actually use the same, more of the same, or do they use, do they just regulate with distinct measures and that's it? So the closer the countries are to that line, the more unique measure or the less of the same they use. So this is the main output table, where you would where you use different models showing different identification, basically showing the identification strategy. And the first column would be one where I exclude the tariff rate. The second model is where I don't include interaction terms with the PTA. Then there's an MFN only where I exclude the regulatory distance. And then the last three columns are basically looking at different types of provisional sets, where here you have the harmonization provisions, the facilitation ones, and then basically where I just add them up. Well, first, in terms of identification of the non-tariff component, if you look at the first column, you would see that actually there is the overall PTA effect has a coefficient of 0.3. That's adding up the PTA dummy, which is PTA, and the PTA tech coefficient evaluated at the average number of provisions. So that would give you a whole effect of the PTA. So and then if you jump to a model where you would include the tariff rate, you would see that actually the overall PTA effect is decreasing. So that actually once you include the tariff rate, you see that that coefficient drops, and that's actually mimicking then the non-tariff component of the PTA. So as a kind of like check on how well that actually predicts the actual tariff reductions is that I calculate the implied tariff reduction from the models that we get. That would be where I take the overall PTA effect or where I take this, the 0.8 coefficient, the tariff inclusive PTA in fact, from the coefficients where the NTM only, and I evaluate that divide that by the tariff elasticity, and then you get an implied tariff reduction or tariff effect of that. So, and in the data, you would have a tariff reduction in the PTAs of approximately 4.2, 4.3. And so most of these models are actually picking up the tariff component quite well, because let's say for most of them, the implied tariff reduction by the model is 4.3, 4.5, 4.2. So it's actually mimicking that quite well. Message number two is that actually interaction with the NTM variable matters for the interpretation of the actual coefficients. So if you look at the no interaction model, you would see that the coefficient doesn't matter or is very small. And as soon as you actually start interacting the PTA or the NTM specific provisions with the NTM indicators, you see that actually it gains importance. So yeah. Then message number 3 is, how does regulatory distance interact with the MFN type of behind the border measures? So there's this discussion that within all these NTM estimates, the trade promoting effect is somehow entangled with the trade restrictive effect. So that's actually seen quite nicely here, that if you would come from a model where you just have MFN only and you introduce the regulatory distance, the MFN coefficients become more negative. So somehow the regulatory distance actually picks up the positive impact of reducing or mimicking one another's regulation. So because eventually, if you would introduce a measure, right, and that reduces the regulatory distance, it would actually promote trade. So that seems to be kind of like disentangled a little bit by introducing this distance indicator. Then message number 4 would be that the trade promoting effect of PTA, of the provisions, is actually driven by those harmonization type of provisions. So if you look at the differences in between the harmonization and the facilitation coefficient, you see that actually the harmonization type of provisions are actually driving the effects. And that is probably also the case for when you include all of them. And this is pretty much as expected, that and those provisions that actually target those NTMs are the ones that are most effective. And then number 5 is the lower part, you would see the actual implied ABE reduction. So for PTAs, those are the PTA-induced trade cost reductions. So these can be readily used, for example, in model simulations. And the actual ABEs for the baseline NTMs are those that would be a 1% reduction in the actual NTM value. And you would see that the 1% reduction in the distance would be a 1.5 reduction or 1.5 reduction in the ABE. So, and to put that in perspective a little bit, that what the PTA effect is, so the PTA effect approximately is a reduction in the distance from the third quartile to the median. So that's kind of like that. And if you would also move from the third quartile to the median for the stringency index, for the behind the border measures, it would be an ABE of 6.7%. So now we have a count index, and the problem with these count indices is always, okay, do we actually get a trade effect already from the first provision onwards, right? So can we just count them up simply by saying, okay, we have one provision and get a 0.02 trade effect, etc. So to test that, I included a square term and to check whether there's an actual reward to depth. So, and this is shown here, where I include where the actual PTA coefficient becomes negative, and the squared index or the square term is actually positive and highly significant. So that would imply that there's a type of U shape, right? That only after a certain amount of provisions or a certain amount of depth achieved, you would actually get positive trade effects. So it's not that you can just include one provision or agree on one provision and then you get actually these effects. So in the simple test of, so these sort of turning points would be for harmonization provisions after 4, and for if you include all positions would be after 12. And the simple test would be whether you actually get the U shape, is that you run a regression where you exclude all PTA observations below the turning point and above the turning point. So, and if and then it actually gives you the types of coefficients where first they are negative when you only include those below the turning point, and then if you only include those PTA provisions above the turning point, then you actually get a positive coefficient. So it kind of like is a sort of a simple test for U shape. So can we now say that facilitation type of provisions are completely useless and that they don't contribute to anything? Not necessarily. When you interact the harmonization with the facilitation provisions, you get a positive coefficient, and it seems like that there is some some interaction between those, which also is the suggestion in the previous table so it actually seems that facilitation provisions promote the harmonization effect. If I were to guess,
please.
2
minutes, please.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So if I were to guess, this is obviously non-causal, but just by looking at what the average number of provisions per observation is below and above the turning point for the harmonization type of provisions, the guess would probably be that much action lies in those that relate to actual standardization and audits and control, because there you see the big kind of like shifts in absolute terms. And on the TBT side, it seems that in absolute terms, the technical regulations are the one where a lot of action is. While on the facilitation end, it seems that after the third quartile of the harmonization index, there isn't really much action anymore. So yeah, but I think there's still ongoing research by others who actually try to pin down the actual provisional effects. Yeah. And this is just indicative. Then lastly, I try to proxy. Okay, when we talk about scenarios where we try to abolish NTMs, I mean, these things have a purpose. So you I don't know whether you can really talk about abolishing, but if you want to have a proxy of what might be burdensome or excess regulation, try to proxy that whether by subtracting the number of unique measures from the average number of measures, to kind of get, okay, what might be excess, then you get these coefficients, and the marginal, and as expected, the marginal effect of introducing a new measure, a new type of measure, is much higher than actually introducing a measure that is already there. And so maybe there is something where you can say in the regulatory design that you can get rid of these. On the differentiating between SPS and TBTs, we see that actually much of the action is on the TBT end, which for total trade makes sense because TBTs are employed across more sectors, also those that actually have high value in trade. So it is, unsurprising. Yeah, to conclude, so I hope to have identified different types of channels of regulatory heterogeneity, and basically gave an indication on what harmonization might entail. I think there's some interesting terms of when on the PTA side, if you want to take these PTA coefficient there, I think they can be readily used in simulations, and they have been used in simulations. But if you actually want to talk about regulatory alignment, I think there are a couple of interesting scenarios coming out of it, because once you introduce a measure, you may get positive effects from, by mimicking the measure of your export markets, but on the other hand, you may also, move away from other export markets, and at the same time, you have these MFN type of effects. So that's something to figure out in the future, what this might mean for scenario design, because you have all these moving parts that come together, and and then the next step is to actually take that to the sectoral level and see what that gives. So thanks. Should be in time.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much, Hakeem. I guess at this point, again, we're open for questions through any of the means available. You can type in the chat and I'll read it for everyone. Raise your hand, or you can just unmute and pose your question.
May I ask a question?
Of course, yes, please.
Yes, I'm really interested in your study because it's very close correlated with linked to my study, the regulatory issues. But because I have something to do during your presentation, so I missed the main idea. Could you summarize it in some simple words, and to make me understand what you are doing now?
So basically, it's trying to identify within one kind of like estimation framework different types of channels of regulatory differences. and also assess where PTAs are actually, what type of differences PTAs actually address. Because if you're in the main regression table, you would see that PTAs or the technical provisions in PTAs seem to be working particularly with the regulatory differences of measures that are different in terms of structure. And yeah, it's basically a way to identify these different channels and yeah, eventually I guess take that if once you want to negotiate a PTA, how do you design best these yeah, regulatory components, the SPS and TBT components of these PTAs, and how do you inform larger simulations of PTAs, and as well as what happens if countries regulate and they may move away from certain trading partners but closer to others. That has implications. And yeah, that's something at least to try to start the discussion on something that has already been done a lot on the product level, I guess, especially for agricultural goods. I know many studies that actually work with these different type of distances and where they have really, really detailed policy information. And yeah, and here I try to take that a bit on a more on a broader level, on the total trade level, and I'm curious to see what the sectors give, whether they whether there's a lot of sectoral heterogeneity in these types of effects, and then yeah, just see what the data tells us, or yeah.
So you compared. I see you do econometric studies. So you compared a bunch of PTAs, their regulatory provisions, to see how much distance there are.
Exactly.
Between different.
It's what PTAs in the past have achieved in terms of trade cost reductions, given a certain set or given the actual baseline NTM estimates. And that is kind of like a way to say, okay, instead of assuming that you have a certain reduction in some trade costs, you could actually say, okay, well, in the past that happened, so let's use that to inform our scenario. And here, yeah, that's yeah, and try to differentiate that from previous studies where, for example, the Egger study, who use just a PTA dummy, which basically encompasses a lot of provisions, and here actually trying to flesh out what do these technical provisions actually bring. That is not to say, I guess the verdict is still out there. Now that you have all this these PTA data where you have, I don't know, 1,000 different variables on all types of provisions within PTAs, and everyone is trying to figure out, okay, what is actually generating good trade effects? And this is just a simple approach to do that via these interaction terms, which seem to matter. I'm not sure whether it's also the case for other policy areas, like, for example, for investment. At least what I hope to show is here that your investment effects or the effects of investment provisions or other provisions lie within, let's say, the 4% or something like that. That it can exclude, say, okay, here we have the technical measure effect, and here you might have other effects, and yeah, trying to kind of like contribute in disentangling that.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
This is low.
Okay, we have from Anna, we have a question in the chat. First of all, thanking you for a nice presentation. What is the level of sector aggregation you're working with, and how do you reconcile the trains NTM data with that aggregation?
Yeah, so for now, so I work with, so the presentation was just for aggregate trade, where I exclude the energy sectors and the services sectors, and just goods trade. And so I work at the aggregate trade level, and for the sectoral regressions, I work also with GTAP sectors, because I need to retain the domestic absorption, because that's part of the identification strategy. So it's kind of the difference with the previous studies, which work at the product level. But on the product level, you don't really have domestic absorption, and that is part of, I guess, getting hold of the differences in intra versus extra, like this whole discussion on that you need intra trade flows to identify international trade costs correctly. So try to use that channel. On the NTM trains, NTM data, I aggregated up from the 6-digit level upwards. So those are just simple averages. So I calculate the regulatory distance per product, and then you have a square matrix of these distances, and those are then just aggregated up by simple averages into the GTAP sectors or into the aggregates. I don't know whether that answers the question. And then the same with the just average number of measures. That's also just simple averages.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Leaving the floor open for someone to jump in with unmuting if you'd like. Okay, well, I appreciate the presentation, Akim.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do have a question for the channel. Is anyone here to present the paper modeling the proposed US-UK trade agreement in GTAP that was originally supposed to be Jeffrey Ferry presenting? Okay, I see no one is claiming that they're here to present that. So with that, I think we're tasked with moving ahead to the fourth presentation. So I know I saw Jose here.
Yeah, good morning. My colleague Ida Roseheimer will present the paper.
Yes,
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is a case where we have a substitution. Yeah. Okay. Well, with that, Ira, if you would like to take the floor and share your screen
Yeah,
or your
sure.
application, you may begin.
Okay, so thank you. Sorry about all that. Good morning. Okay, so go to slide 2, please. What we're looking at is the impact of the US-UK free trade agreement with worker displacement added into the model. And the overview here is that the US and the UK are currently negotiating a free trade agreement, and it's likely to be agreed this year. So we look at first the UK government's own estimates of the impact of the free trade agreement. Then we look at our baseline model using GTAP. And we're using the standard GTAP model, GTAP 10 database, reference year 2014. We're going to compare our model to the UK basic model. And we find that the free trade agreement is beneficial to both countries, although less beneficial in our model than in the UK government model. And then we're going to introduce worker displacement into the model, and we find it reduces the GDP benefits of the free trade agreement, suggesting that worker displacement matters when modeling trade. So move to the next slide, please. Okay, so the basic economics of the situation are the US is a $21 trillion economy. The UK is 2 trillion pounds. That's roughly close to $3 trillion in GDP. From the US point of view, the UK is our 7th largest trading partner. Exports to the UK in 2019 were 69 billion in goods and 78 billion in services. Imports are, I wonder if I could make this a little bit bigger somehow. There. Imports are 63 billion in goods and 62 billion in services. And it's interesting that according to US data, the US runs a small surplus in both categories. According to the UK data, the UK runs a small surplus in both categories. The goods and services figures are roughly the same, but not exactly the same. And from the UK point of view, the US is their #1 trading partner now that they've left the European Union. Both are high-wage industrial countries. Both already have low tariffs, so you wouldn't expect huge changes when you move to absolute free trade, abolishing all tariffs. The UK rate is 6% on US goods, and the other way around, the US rate on UK goods is only 4%. The UK government, in proposing the deal and selling it to the UK public, has highlighted the opportunities to increase exports to the US of motor vehicles and parts and financial services. And the US government has highlighted opportunities to increase agricultural exports. So, Roman, if you could move to the next slide, please. There's a quick overview of the government, the findings of the UK government using a model known as GE Trade, which is a variant of GTAP. They used the 2011 GTAP database. They found small but significant benefits from the free trade agreement, a rise of $4.8 billion or 0.16% in GDP. They found the abolition of all tariffs. By the way, they have two scenarios. I'm using scenario 2, which is moving all tariffs to zero and reducing non-tariff benefits too. And what they found was UK exports would rise to the US, specifically up 7.7%. UK imports from the US rise a very similar amount, 8.6%. Total exports would go up 1.3%. And total imports up 0.2%. And that the model translates the real wage increase across the UK working population to 0.2%. Sectors where the UK gains include energy, motor vehicles and parts, and electronic equipment. Sectors where the UK loses employment include agriculture, financial services, other transport, which is mainly aerospace, business services, and communications. On to the next slide, please. So for our baseline model, using GTAP 10, we abolish all tariffs in both countries. We assume full employment, and we get small increases in both the US and UK GDP. Industrially, the UK motor vehicle industry benefits from increased exports to the US. The UK energy and petrochemical industries also benefit, reflecting the fact that the UK is a large exporter of energy from the North Sea in the US, although a producer is still an importer of energy goods. The US increased benefits are narrow in sectoral terms, limited to food and beverage, textiles, and construction. But to compare the two models, we find smaller increases in GDP for the UK than the UK government's Department of International Trade found. They found 4.8 billion increase to GDP. We find only $364 million. That's 0.01%. And for the US, we find a tiny increase in GDP of just $114 million, which you can see from the number on the screen is a very tiny percentage. Trade deficits rise in both countries, reflecting the fact that abolishing tariffs allows more imports to come in. Okay, next slide, please. This is a sectoral breakdown of changes in output by 24 sectors and changes in the trade balance. And some of the highlights are that the trade balance fell by about $1 billion in both countries. Both countries already have trade deficits, so it's an expansion of a deficit. In the and as I said, some of the largest growth sectors are textiles and leather, and some of the largest declines are furniture and paper industries, which are already large importing sectors in both countries. Transportation equipment manufacturing fell in the US but increased in the UK, confirming what the UK government believes, that they can get a larger share of the US motor vehicle market through abolishing tariffs. For the US, the trade balance grew the most in food and beverage manufacturing and fell the most in transportation equipment. And for the UK, the trade balance grew the most in chemical manufacturing, which, as I said, is related to the petroleum industry, and fell the most in recreational services. So if we move on to the next slide, please. These are further results in changes in imports and exports. With free trade, imports increased in every sector in both the US and the UK, with the most important import growth occurring in the wood and rubber industry. smaller industries where I think the growth is larger in percentage terms. Similarly, most export growth occurred in the textile and leather industries and the wood and rubber industries. Export growth fell the most in the paper and utility sector, and petrochemical exports increased in the UK, but not the US. Okay, on to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is where we introduce the concept of worker displacement. The standard GTAP model is a long-term model, of course. Empirically, in the real world, in other words, sectoral employment loss leads to job loss for some period of time, not the long term necessarily, but obviously job transitions are not instantaneous. So we adjust the model to reflect the fact that workers are out of work for a medium term period. And there are surveys done by the US Bureau of Labor Statistics which show that between 25 and 60% of workers who lose their job due to a mass layoff event or a factory closing are displaced or unemployed for a period of 1 to 3 years. And you can see the consistent survey results in the graph. And import penetration often takes the form of these sorts of events. So using the BLS survey results, we find in the manufacturing sector, 36% of manufacturing workers are displaced for a period of 1 to 3 years. So let's call it an average of 2 years. And you get the same effect for 29% of non-manufacturing workers. In the UK, there are similar research papers done, not a government study published every 2 years as in the US, but there have been a number of studies done which allow us to make a similar estimate. The estimate's actually slightly smaller. 24% of workers are unemployed for a period of an average of 2 years after a mass closing event. And we also want to point out, you may be familiar with work by Peterson on unemployment, on what he calls frictional unemployment. That's a different phenomenon. That is unemployment that exists at all times because of job search in the job market and doesn't react to macroeconomic events. What we're looking at is something else, quite specific. And what Peterson says is absolutely true. Obviously, there's always a certain amount of unemployment as people change jobs independently of the state of the economy. Worker displacement is increased unemployment for a medium-term period due to an import surge or another macroeconomic event. Okay, so that's the economic context. And if you move to the next slide, we explain how we introduce it into the model. We know which sectors experience a fall in jobs. I just quickly went over that in the earlier slides. And we now define a proportion of job losses in those sectors which don't lead to new jobs in the gaining sectors. And we discuss here how we reduce the wage bill by the share, by those unemployment worker displacement figures in each respective sector, and then put the new wage bill numbers into the model. And the numbers we use are 36.4% for manufacturing, 29.2% for services, and for the UK, 18% for metal manufacturing is worker displacement, data from the literature, and 24% for all other sectors. Okay, so if you move on to the next slide, please, Roman. We find that that significantly reduces economic growth from the free trade agreement. UK GDP growth falls from $364 million to $202 million. US GDP actually changes from that tiny positive amount of $114 million to negative $142 million. Very tiny change in GDP, but now it's negative rather than positive. And the GDP growth is smaller, obviously, because displaced workers are a straight loss to GDP. They're not working. And the US GDP growth is negative due to losses in sectors including motor vehicles and computer and electronics are now producing less output than they were in the previous model. So it's an interesting insight into what could be the effect from a trade agreement after a roughly 2-year time period. Okay, move on to the next slide. We show the sectoral changes, and they are similar to the baseline model, but more pronounced negatives in transportation, equipment, particularly paper and mining, I see, and also services. And the total trade balance fell for both the US and the UK. However, in the worker displacement model, it fell by less in the UK and more in the US, reflecting the fact both countries have a worse trade deficit, but there's more of an impact of worker displacement in the US, reflecting the fact of increased exports in those manufacturing sectors in the US. So move on to the next slide, please. We also did some work on propensity to export and propensity to import for the US and the UK. Propensity to export refers to the relationship between exports and GDP and imports and GDP. And in both countries, propensity to import is slightly more than propensity to export, 0.16 and 0.17 for the US, and 0.34 and 0.35 for the UK. However, our results show much higher propensities, 10 and 24 for the US and 4.8 and 11 for the UK. And what these show are that when you have a trade shock, the propensity to export and propensity to import is much stronger than the results you get econometrically by looking at the historical data on the relationship between imports and exports and GDP. In our model, the trade changes happen radically first, and then the GDP impact is reduced in magnitude. Therefore, the propensities for trade are implicitly captured in the model, are a better indicator than a direct application of estimated propensities. So directionally, they all are moving in the right direction. The US and the UK have a greater propensity to import than to export. We didn't make changes to the model in this case, but we've done previous work where some countries have a greater propensity to import than others, and we modify the elasticities to reflect that. In this case, we didn't need to modify the elasticities, but we wanted to tell you a little bit about the work and the estimates we've done there. Okay, so if you move on to the next and last slide, to summarize our results, firstly, our baseline GTAP model shows much smaller growth benefit from a US-UK free trade agreement than the UK government model's version shows, $364 million versus $4.8 billion. And, we think, the UK government published a 200-page study, but without a great deal of the the data detail of how they got to their results. And, frankly, they want to make this look as good as possible to the UK public, which was the audience for that study. All three models show the trade deficit worsens for both countries as a result of the free trade agreement. Lower tariffs and higher GDP growth brings in more imports. Worker displacement, which is the major modification we've introduced, reduces the benefit for both countries by hundreds of millions of dollars because, broadly speaking, a quarter or a third of the displaced workers are out of work for 1 to 3 years. And we believe the worker displacement model makes the model likely more accurate as a medium-term guide to outcomes, but not necessarily incompatible with the standard model results, which are themselves described as a predictor of the long-term outcome. The UK government in its study advises readers to think of 15 years as an estimate of what they mean by long-term outcome for the trade model. Finally, propensities are captured well in the model already, with both countries exhibiting a significantly greater propensity to import than to export. In other studies in the future, we may adjust the Armington elasticities to reflect the propensity ordering from econometrics. And with that, I'm done. Oh, I do have one more slide, directions for further research. We want to look further at worker displacement, how it has regional effects in regional economies, work that David Auder of MIT has done, comparable to what he's done. And we also want to look at how wage changes from intersectoral transition influence wage income and GDP. And we intend to look further at how propensities to export and import can affect different countries differently by adjusting the Armington elasticities. And with that, I'm happy to take questions. Thank you very much, Roman, for bailing me out from my internet problems. I should also mention, since I haven't said it, that I'm with the Coalition for Prosperous America. My colleague Amanda Mayral helped me, was a co-author of this project, and so was Badri Gopalakrishnan, whom some of you may know, as he's been associated with GTAP for many years and has spoken many times at this conference. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Okay, the floor is open for questions. You can, yeah, please, yeah, unmute yourself and go ahead.
What is your underlying assumption for the rules of origin? Because you only model tariff concessions, right? And within that, and the UK is probably still quite integrated with the EU, and a lot of value added that actually goes into the UK, and then potentially also in the exports to the US is still generated within the EU, but there's no trade agreement with the EU and US. So what type of rules of origin regime do you think might be there, or whether there's going to be a problem or not?
I think that the context is there are no rules of origin rules, that we abolish tariffs and we see the impact. And the context, you're absolutely right that there's no trade agreement for the UK right now with the EU anymore. They continue to trade under previous rules mostly. So I'm not sure how to answer that. I've thought myself, I think in the real world there are going to be rules of origin, but the model simply abolishes all tariffs, which reduces prices, and we see what effects flow through that.
Yeah. I mean, I was just wondering to what degree the UK would be able to actually realize those benefits of greater access to the US market via these tariff concessions, if the US employs rules of origin and much of the actual value added of these exports is still generated in a zone, right, in a region that doesn't have a PTA with the US. So I don't know how to model that. I mean, that's probably an issue, right?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think that is an issue. For instance, motor vehicles, as you may know, there's a 25% US tariff on trucks. And I tried to find in the UK study what assumptions they made about that. And I assume, since there's no mention of it, that that's fully abolished in the model, which would explain a lot of the gain, I would think, for the UK, since that's a huge tariff compared to the 4%, 2 to 4% the US has on cars. So you're right. If the US stands firm on that tariff, then the gains would be smaller. Is that the question you're? Am I addressing the question you're asking?
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, it's an issue in terms of modeling it. In terms of the underlying assumption is that how these tariff concessions can be actually utilized, given the complex integration of the UK.
Yes, I agree. If one was. Yeah, there are issues of rules of origin. There are also issues of politics. In the UK document, it says it won't accept US food that doesn't meet UK standards. And I think that would limit, agriculture has been a big issue for many US trade deals, right? That's what the US sees potential gains. If other countries don't want to allow US agricultural products in, that limits the gains also.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Additional?
Yeah, It's a multi-country model, GTAP. What about China, about the European Union? Because I think that the most of the dynamic of your model came from the bilateral tariff reduction. It's okay?
Bilateral tariff reduction, yes.
Are you consider a tariff from apply from European Union, from US to China, for instance? Maybe this will change the results. You consider other players like China, US, European Union.
It broke up somewhat. You asked if we considered the impact of other players. Roman, I think I've got better reception from you. Could you repeat the question, please?
Okay.
Sorry,
I think that the dynamic of your model came from tariff reduction from bilateral, from US to UK, yeah, and to UK to US. But maybe some of the dynamic will be changed if you consider tariff applied from US to China and to other players in the model.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're asking about in the real world, things could change a lot, depending. Obviously, the US trades much more with China than with the UK, and it trades more with Germany than with the UK, I believe. So many things could change. You're absolutely right. If policies change in other countries. Right now we've got very complicated China tariff situation that is clearly going to change over the next several years. So yeah, that could limit or increase the gains the UK could make in the US market. I agree with that point. I mean, you can only model so much in a single model, right? So you can see our focus was on the ideas we brought forward. Yes, so that's my response.
Okay.
Okay, Jeff, thank you very much. I think looking at the clock here, we should probably move to our fourth presentation. Sorry, I have too many things open at this point. Yeah, so
okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, Ronsheimer is going to take the floor and discuss impact of the trade agreement between Latin American countries and East Asia Pacific. You have the floor.
Good morning. So you can see my screen with the presentation, right? Yeah, perfect.
Yes.
So welcome to our presentation. As mentioned, we will present the effects of an economic and economic and social effects of a possible trade agreement between Latin America and Asia Pacific. I'm co-author of this paper together with José Durán Lima, who is chief of the Regional Integration Unit at the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and also together with Ángel Aguiar, who is research economist at GTAP. So just to go quickly through the outline, I will start off by giving an introduction, pointing out the status quo of current trade agreements and tariffs, move on to the methodology sections where I will be talking about the model and our assumptions and how we integrated micro-level data on firms. And in the results section, I will point out the production, the effects on production, welfare, and employment, the effects on exporting firms by size, and winning and losing sectors of this bi-regional agreement, and conclude with some final thoughts. So on this slide, you can see two Sankey charts depicting the participation of Latin American large and micro, small, and medium-sized MSME enterprises in exports to both of the regions. So on the left-hand chart, you see the stream representing the number of exporting companies. So you can see here that, for example, Mexican MSMEs have a quite large stream to Latin America. So there are many companies, many MSMEs exporting to Latin America, and less MSMEs are exporting to Asia Pacific. Whereas if we look at the large companies from these countries depicted here, their streams are way smaller because they are just less, there are less big or large companies, but these export basically to both regions. If we now turn to the Sankei on the right-hand side, we can see the streams representing the amounts exported. And here the picture basically flips because we can see that the large firms have larger streams. And it's interesting to see that these, for example, if we look at Brazil here, these are basically divided. So the large firms in Brazil export actually more to Asia Pacific than they export to their own region. Whereas now the MSMEs, represented by smaller streams, they mainly export to their own region and less so to Asia Pacific. Now, turning to the motivation, like the basis of our paper is the, in 2020, concluded Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And as we can derive from the Senkeis, there are trade ties or relatively strong trade ties between Latin America and Asia Pacific. So we would expect the RCEP agreement to have an effect on Latin America, which is why we want to model in this, or why we modeled in this paper, a bi-regional trade agreement between the two regions. And the novelty of our paper here is that we include firm-level data. So our goal is to assess the impact of MSMEs, but also large companies in Latin America and the Caribbean. At this stage, I would also like to point out that my colleague and me, we work for the United Nations Economic Commission. So our main objective is to improve policymaking, and that is why many assumptions and the setup is driven by the idea on how to give policy recommendations in the end. So let me turn to the status quo. Here we can see the current trade interrelations between Latin American and Caribbean countries. So you can see in the map, the large integration schemes here. And what turns out is that if we look down here in this part of the area, there is a lot of gray space. So there are no FTAs or no partial agreements concluded yet. Overall, intra-regional tariff relations in Latin America are quite advanced, as at least 70% of the trade is carried out under preferential trade agreements covered by these integration schemes. And if we turn to the figure on the right-hand side, you can see that between 1990 and 2019, MFNN, most favored nation tariff, as well as intra-regional applied tariffs decreased, which implies a larger openness to intra-regional trade circuits. Now, turning to the RCEP members, we have a similar map here, and you can see there are way less gray areas in this map, and in ASEAN, especially in ASEAN, already 90% of the goods are imported with tariffs equal to 0 in the intra-regional trade, so they are quite well integrated already. And what is a key part of the RCEP agreement is the deepening of the bilateral relations between China and Japan on the one hand, and between China and the Republic of Korea on the other. If we turn to the figure 3, the right-hand figure, you can see the most favored nation tariff reductions between 1992 and 2019, and you can also here see a decreasing trend similar to Latin America and the Caribbean, and here especially China stakes out with a very dramatic decrease. Now, if we turn to the bilaterally applied tariffs by economic sectors, that is very interesting and very important for our assumptions. We can see that the tariffs implemented by Latin America here, especially in the sectors agriculture, livestock, and fishing, as well as food, drinks, and tobacco, and textiles, there are very high trades tariffs applied to imports from Asia Pacific, whereas if we turn to the implemented tariffs by Asia, these are also high on food, drinks, and tobacco and textiles, but also on rubber and plastic and other manufacturers. And what is interesting here is that the tariffs on mining and oil are very low, like around 1% in both of the regions. So overall, it can be observed that in both regions, intra-regional tariffs are highest in agriculture and agro-industry. So these both represent sectors of sensitive products. So here we are talking about rice, wheat, vegetable seeds, sugar, meat, beverages, and tobacco. And now I will move on to the model specifications. So we used version 11 of the GTAP model, including 41 economies, mainly from Latin America and Asia Pacific, and 39 sectors. Used the standard GDP model, and here we have some assumptions and some factors that we included or excluded in the model and changed. Firstly, the unemployment of unskilled labor. Here we took into account that there are fairly high levels of unemployment in Asia Pacific as well as Latin America, and the unemployment assumption we allow, the wage of unskilled labor is fixed, so we allow for worker mobility between the sectors. Secondly, capital accumulation. So here we want to estimate the longer-term benefits of trade openness and assume that the impact of tariff reduction might translate into changes on the levels of capital, of savings or capital, and this might increase or decrease the initial capital stock from the equilibrium level. Now, the sensitive products, that's what I just pointed out. If we account for sensitive products, we would reduce if we assume a free trade agreement, but including sensitive products, we would reduce all tariff levels to 0 except for the sensitive products. In this case, tariff levels will remain as before to protect these domestic productions. Also, we included trade facilitation, assuming the iceberg cost. So programs derived from a technology shock, implying a 2% increase in the transit of goods from origin to destination. And now moving to the 3 scenarios, which we understand as like additive scenarios. So the first one here assumes only a free trade zone for the RCEP countries as implied by the RCEP agreement. The second one assumes a free trade agreement within Latin America, so trade under 0 tariffs within Latin America. And the third adds up the previous 2 scenarios and assumes a bi-regional free trade agreement between the 2 regions, between the RCEP countries in Latin America, but also within both of these regions. And so basically these rectangles show the different model combinations that we have here that we played a little bit with, and I will now turn to the second part of the methodology, where we included the information on firm level data for 13 Latin American countries. So this map basically represents the countries, or highlights the countries that would be included in case of a bi-regional trade agreement. So on the one hand, we have the RCEP countries on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side, we have the Latin American and Caribbean countries included. And you can see that the dark colored countries are the countries for which micro level or firm level data was available that we included in the analysis. Our base scenario on which we build these market simulations is the bi-regional free trade agreements with 0 tariffs, unemployment, and also trade facilitation across and within regions, which has then been, so the model output from the GTAP model under this scenario has been combined with micro-level data. So we had data on exports on a 6-digit harmonized system. We had the countries of destination and origin, obviously, and the type of agent. This has been classified based on sales data. And if the sales data was not available for a given country, we used exports as a proxy. So different ranges defining whether it's a large or MSME. This is a more formal representation of what we did. So by the exports for a given point in time, base year of reference, by a respective country of origin, to a destination, by sector or industry, by the economic type of agent, and that has been multiplied by the change as indicated by the GTAP model output for the given industry and origin and destination. So at the same time, besides deriving the impact on firms, we also helped or tried to validate the GTAP database. Now, coming to some of the first results of our paper, what we did here, or you see here the scenario, the bi-regional free trade agreement with 0 tariffs, with unemployment and full employment and trade facilitation. So under full employment, you can see that GDP is expected to rise by 0.46% in Asia Pacific or the RCEP countries, and in Latin America by 0.35. So the effect is a little bit less. If we now take into account unemployment and as a standard closure, the effect actually increases, especially in the ASEAN countries, especially also in the Republic of Korea, and also for Latin America and the Caribbean, here especially in the case of the Central American Common Market. And if we now also include the capital accumulation, we can see that the effects become even more stronger here. So as we think that, or as it is considered that the results are more plausible under the assumption of unemployment, because in practice both regions have people in the working age who are out of employment, we, for the further, or in our main simulation used for the combined with the micro simulations, we use this scenario with unemployment. Now this slide further specifies in poco a little bit what we did. So if we have here the full impact, taking into account these scenarios underneath, so they basically add up, we have an increase in exports from Latin America by 5%, also imports increase, but also in the RCEP regions. So if we account for the different layers, if we add these up, here we talk about tariff reduction, trade facilitation, then we have quite a strong effect of a bi-regional agreement. Whereas if only RCEP countries would reduce tariffs or increase trade facilitation, we would have a positive effect on RCEP countries, but this would be negative for Latin America and the Caribbean. On the other hand, if we only had free trade in Latin America and trade facilitation, we would have a positive effect in this region and a negative effect on the RCEP countries. So this now here in the gray shaded lines, we included also the sensitive sectors, meaning that for these sensitive products, tariff levels have not been reduced. And we can see that this has, in case of the textiles, agro-industrial and industrial products, this would have a strong positive effect, especially for Latin America and the Caribbean. This effect is less strong if we exclude tariff reductions on agricultural products. However, in our scenario for the micro simulations, these sensitive sectors have not been excluded, so we assume zero tariffs for all products. Now, this slide shows the results on production in 3 graphs on primary products, light manufacturers, and heavy manufacturers. So by comparing the GDP variations on these 3 sectors, we can see a more pronounced increase in the agriculture and agro-industry for Latin America on the one hand, and a more pronounced increase in heavy manufacturing among Asian Pacific countries. And it may not seem, but the net balance in terms of economic expansion is positive. And it could be said that sectoral rearrangement is taking place here, in which productive specialization and export patterns are enhanced in favor of the comparative advantages in both of these regions. And now I would like to turn to the micro simulations here.
2 minutes remaining.
Okay, so here you can see that in case of a bi-regional scenario, we would see that the MSMEs are increasing their exports. Not only the large companies are gaining here. So the winning sectors here would be food and pharmaceutical products, and electrics and electronic equipments. Now I will rush a little bit. I'm sorry about that. Here you would see the effect by sectors on Latin American and Asia. We can see mostly a positive effect for medium-sized enterprises and big enterprises. And let me now move to this part of the conclusion. So we would expect a stronger positive impact on exports from Latin America on MSMEs than compared to large companies. Generally, the winning sectors are expected to be meats and dairy products, beverage and tobacco, primarily in the region of LAC or Latin America. The winning countries are agriculture and agro-industrial exports, Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, Colombia, and Panama. Losing sectors are the textile, clothing, and footwear, primarily due to the low ability to compete by Latin American countries. And what we can say is clearly that in case of RCEP, the treaty would negatively impact trade with Latin America if there is no bi-regional agreement formed. And the identification of losing sectors sheds light on the defensive positions in the event of future negotiations. I talked a lot about the agricultural sectors and sensitive products. And what is very important here is that the estimations on possible effects of MSMEs may increase the willingness to negotiate a bi-regional agreement, and that RCEP, or this bi-regional agreement, is not only about tariff reduction but also trade facilitation. And I want to conclude by stating the novelty of our paper, including firm level data, which is very difficult to get. But this also brings some problems due to the low availability of recent years and sales data. So this might be kind of a limitation of our paper, but we're still working on it. Happy to receive feedback or recommendations. And thank you for your time. We open to questions now.
Okay, thank you very much, Ira. We are open for questions. Again, we're a small group, so anyone that wants to just unmute themselves and pose their question directly is probably the easiest way.
I have a question. Because from your background introduction, I see that the big firms export more from Latin America to RCEP region, to Asia Pacific. So I expect the free trade agreement between Latin America and Asia Pacific might benefit these big firms. But your results show that small SMEs tends to benefit more in lots of sectors. So why is that?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Also, I want to welcome my colleague Jose. Feel free to join this discussion, obviously. So one of the reasons might be that trade facilitation. So there are some barriers for small-sized enterprises, which makes it just easier and more convenient for them to export to their own region and to stay there. But if we account for trade facilitation and zero tariffs, this might lower the barrier for them to also go and export further out of the region. Sure, if you want to add anything, Jose.
Yes. The medium and small medium firms gain a lot from trade facilitation. This is one of the reasons. But one of the results that we compare with your approach that try to compare the gain from domestic firms from the firms that export to the world. In the case of Latin America, there are some firms that lost. For instance, some Latin American firms that now are exporting, for instance, Central American exporting to Mexico, to South America in textile, will lose with Vietnam and China in that sector.
Sorry, you mute yourself.
Sorry, because I said we reduce tariff also in our simulation for that sectors. Then it's very important to know that there are winner and loser sector. We, with our approach, taking in account the micro data from custom in every country, we try to find some idea about the winner and loser among firms, among bigger firms, among smaller firms, and we show that in agriculture and food sectors there are a lot of gain in some particular countries, especially in Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay. But in the case of Central American countries, some small firms lose a lot with competition from Asia. Then our idea is to put on the table of policymaker this conclusion to manage the negotiations. This is the idea.
I got it. Thanks.
Any additional questions for our last presenting group? So we are right at the end of the closing time for this session. So I will go ahead. Just a reminder, there's one more concurrent session coming up. I think it begins at 8:30. I'm actually going to dash off and open another room here for one of those. And then I believe at 11 Eastern time, so offset your clock accordingly, Eastern US. the last plenary session for the conference to close it out. With that, I'm going to close out this room and stop our recording and allow you to move on to your next thing. Thank you to all of our presenters.